So just a quick overview of what I'm going to cover today. First, some background on some 2016 Internet Research Agency activity that kind of kicked off this whole research effort. And then I'll kind of delve into a little bit of the difference between information operations or influence operations in cybersecurity, give some background on cyber threat intel, and then I'll get into our case study and how we went about identifying an associated actor and then building out infrastructure associated with this activity. So to start off, the impetus for this case study came from 2018 articles from Wired and the Daily Beast. These articles describe some 2016 Internet Research Agency activity and some of their information operations efforts on Facebook. I'm not going to recount all of what happened in 2016, that would be horrible, but long story short, the IRA purchased a bunch of Facebook ads, and there were a couple that stood out to us because they kind of towed the line between information operations and computer network exploitation. These ads led the victim to a Face Music Chrome extension, and the landing page for that series of ads was musicfb.info. When installed, some users reported that it began messaging all of their Facebook friends. Daily Beast review of the Chrome extension, an archived copy of it rather, indicated that the extension didn't actually compromise an individual's computer, but was rather used, likely used in a click fraud scheme to generate traffic to advertisements. And so this copy also revealed communication with another domain, xtad.info, which was almost used kind of like a C2 server to make the extension generate traffic to specified websites. So I'm going to pause here real quick and just kind of talk to you about one of the main reasons that I'm doing this talk and did this research. So in this case, there was kind of a cybersecurity hook, but generally information operations or influence operations exist tangentially to cybersecurity. And that tangential connection is often going to be domain and IP infrastructure. Defenders generally aren't going to care about activity visiting propaganda as long as nothing is compromising their networks or assets. And I think this disconnect probably deters some researchers in the cybersecurity realm from leveraging their knowledge, capabilities, and time against strictly information operations problems. In reality, though, cybersecurity individuals and cyber threat analysts are sometimes going to be the best equipped to identify and build out an understanding of these influence networks. So my hope with this talk is that I can get people who exist in those separate spaces talking together a little bit more, and maybe to point out some methodologies for those in the information operations realm to employ in trying to discover better understand the influence operations that they're looking at. So now onto our case study, where we used threat intel tools and capabilities to build out an understanding of infrastructure with associations to the Internet Research Agency. So two terms here to know real quick: whois, which is a record of information used to register a domain. That can include things like name, phone number, email address, etc. And then second, passive DNS, which is a collection of domain IP resolutions that you can use to identify what domains were hosted at a given IP at a certain time. So for this case study, we use the tools listed there on the right, thanks to Domain Tools, RiskIQ, Farsight, and the Internet Archive, all of which were pivotal in this research. So now, given that background IRA activity in those two domains, musicfb.info and xtad.info, here are some of the questions that we're trying to answer through this research. Who registered the domains and what strings are associated with them? What else did they register? which IPs hosted their domains, and what other associations do they have to other domains. What OSINT can we identify from those findings? And all of those questions are really part of a large iterative process that we can use to build out knowledge of IRA's associations. So with that, I'll get into the specifics. So I'm going to start with a whois example and reviewing domain whois to identify a specific actor. Now keep in mind that we're trying to identify as much about this registrant as we can. And for the purposes, for this part of the research, we use predominantly domain tools. So this is the original whois record for the xtad.info domain. So you can see here that it was registered using privacy protection. So that doesn't really get us anywhere. Same thing for musicfb.info. But if we take a look at one of the later whois records for musicfb.info, we start to see some names, some other registration characteristics show up. In this case, a Stanislav Blinov, a phone number, email address. And an even later record for musicfb.info identifies a different address for this individual as well as a different name that they used for the registration. So this is a little bit tough to see. My apologies for that. But we can use those strings that we identified previously in a reverse whois search to identify other domains that they've registered and try and build out our understanding of other strings associated with them. So in this case, we identified 2 additional domains, emotionfrequency.com and vaccineebolavirus.com. And these give us a couple more strings that we can associate with this registrant. Notably, up there, you see a Denograph 2005 at yandex.ru and a Stas Blino at yandex.ru. And one of those email addresses leads us finally to another domain, seometrics.ru. And here are all of the strings that we can attribute to this registrant based off of that whois research, as well as the additional domains that we identified. Now, I want to call out the seometrics.ru. That comes into play a little bit later just because it seems related in terms of content to some of the other activity that this individual may have been involved with. Now, let's throw all of those strings up against OSINT to see what we can find. Hey, Russia. Ultimately, when we throw these strings against OSINT, based off of the email address stasblino at yandex.ru, we see Stanislav Yurievich Blinov is or was a student at the St. Petersburg National Research University of Information Technologies. More specifically, he was in the Design and Safety of Computer Systems Department. We also see associated with that email address a VK account, which is like Russian Facebook, NW code 2. Here are some of the academic papers that he has been involved with. Notably, we see some steganography and digital watermarking related content. And finally, here we have some pictures of Blinov. And a third, if you like something a little bit more pensive. So ultimately, and I'm going to read this explicitly because I think it's important, we assess with moderate confidence that Stanislav Yurievich Blinov, pictured here, most likely registered the domains xtad.info, musicfb.info, and xstat.info that were used in Internet Research Agency information operations. We do not know the extent of Blinov's involvement with the IRA and information operations beyond the registering of these domains. Whois records indicate that Blinov did not transfer ownership of these domains to another entity, which suggests that he was involved with their administration while they were used in operations. Now, you may have noticed there that I included a third domain, extstat.info. and we haven't gone over that yet. Well, spoiler alert, if you thought I was just going to finish after calling out an individual, just wait till I get going. So now we're going to build out some associated infrastructure. And so when I went over these first two domains, I left something out, or I didn't point out something that we can use to tie these domains together. If we take a closer look at these WHOIS records, we can actually see that these domains were registered through the same registrar, Evo Plus Limited, and they were registered at about the same time. In fact, they were registered about 15 seconds apart. To me, this indicates that they were purchased and registered during the same transaction. Now, this doesn't always work, but I'm going to nerd out here. When it does, it's really exciting. So we can do a reverse WHOIS search for domains with a WHOIS record with the same creation timestamp down to the hour and the same registrar listed. In this case, we get about 6 results, including the 2 that we were originally looking at. And we have to check those others to see if they were in fact registered at about the same time. So looking at this extstat.info, we actually see that it was registered about the same time. And in fact, it was 14 seconds before the extad.info domain was registered. So that indicates to me that this domain almost certainly was registered by Blinov during that same transaction as well. And this domain actually leads us to some additional infrastructure. And this gets at that iterative process that I mentioned earlier. So if we take a look at extstat.info and RiskIQ, something notable kind of stands out. And that's these 89 host pairs. And if you don't know what host pairs are, they essentially identify relationships between websites based on the code behind those websites. So in some cases, that relationship might be with social media sites based off of links to the organization's social media pages. And those aren't going to be terribly useful, but it can also identify the use of specific scripts located at other domains, which in this case was much more useful. So amongst these host pairs, we actually start to see a pattern emerge. There are several news sites that have this script source parent relationship. That means that there is or was code at these websites calling out to a script on the extstat.info domain. RiskIQ also provides us with a time period for when that script was present at the site, which we can use to investigate further in the Wayback Machine. Now, these are the 2016 results for that kievsmi.net domain that was at the top of our results in RiskIQ. And so looking at a historic translated version of this website, we see that kievsmi.net is an independent online publication from a Kiev community of journalists that aren't subject to any political impact and contain independent views on events. Color me convinced. So if we look at the source code for this site, and again, my apologies, this is a little bit tough to see, but this is the actual link that calls out to a hit.js JavaScript file at the extstat.info domain. And if we take a look at that link, also in the Wayback Machine, we can actually see the source code the code for that JavaScript file. So ultimately, it appears that this script was collecting user agent info so that it may have been used for monitoring website traffic to the websites that were using the script. Additionally, it may have also been used to serve up ads or other shady files. There's definitely an opportunity here for some more research into both this JavaScript file as well as some other files and folders seemingly related with this activity. But most notably, the script file at extstat.info appears to have been exclusively used by news websites and blogs, many of which appear to peddle fake or satirical news, such as that Kiev SMI site. Additionally, several of these sites have also already been previously identified in reports on the Internet Research Agency trolls. So now, iterating on these domains, we can get a better understanding of who is behind them and what else they are doing. So similar to the research that we did to identify Blinov, we took a look at the WHOIS registration information for those aforementioned domains. This identified a Nevsky News and a federal news agency or Federal Agency of News. Notably, the Federal Agency of News just last week sued Facebook for deleting its account, claiming that it was in no way associated with the Internet Research Agency beyond sharing an office space. The use of this script at their websites, in my estimation, is another indicator of an association between those entities. But there on the right, you can see other domains that were registered using the same WHOIS. And again, some of these domains have already been identified as having an association with the IRA. Notably, Bellingcat called out several of the US Really domains in one of their reports. Additionally, the Neva News, or News of Neva, is funded by Concord Management and Consulting, which was listed in the US indictment of the IRA troll factory. So finally, another methodology that we can use to build out these infrastructure relationships are hosting co-locations. So for this research, we're attempting to identify websites that most likely are owned and operated by the same individual or organization based off of the domains that they are hosted with and the IPs that they are hosted at. So really what we want to do is review these domains IPs, identify those that are most likely dedicated to a single user, and identify the other domains hosted there at the same time as our original domain. So this is an example using fapnews.ru, which was hosted at the 95.213.148.37 IP from January 2017 through May of 2018. And during that same time frame, there's only a couple of other domains that are also hosted there. And many of these, these domains also appear related to the news. So we can, with a pretty good level of confidence, say that these domains are likely related to each other and that this domain is being used by a single entity. So doing that sort of research for all of the domains that we've found to this point, ultimately, this is what we can identify. And you see on the right there, both the IP addresses as well as the domains. And again, we're finding a bunch of these domains are related to news and blog sites. And again, some of these have been identified in IRA troll reports. Some of them are still active, but most are not, at least for these domains. But even for those that aren't still active, I would argue that this provides some good historical context and provides some fodder for retroactive searches as well. So all in all, we identified about 50 domains that have associations with the IRA or an organization behind it. It should be noted that there's varying levels of confidence in those associations based off of how the domains were identified. In this case, I would argue that generally OPSEC that's going to be used, OPSEC that's used in state-sponsored information operations is not going to be as strong as that which is used in the same state's malicious cyber attacks. At least, in this case study, that was the case. This is notable because it means that there's an opportunity for us to exploit registration and hosting tactics using cyber threat intelligence tools and capabilities. And in doing so, researchers may be able to more thoroughly identify networks of propaganda pushers, trolls, and the possible goals of those information operations. So finally, these methodologies aren't just applicable to foreign actors. We can also use them to build out an understanding of domestic influence operations as well. So Definers is a conservative public relations firm closely associated with the America Rising PAC and was recently in the news for their relationship with Facebook and influence operations efforts. So doing some similar research against this entity, in this case using a registrant email domain and specific Google Analytics account number, we can identify all of these domains. And notably here, we see a fake Tim Cook campaign site, drafttimcook.org, a collegetransparency.com site focused on maligning Yale, and also something a little bit more questionable, an organization that's bidding to build the border wall. My last and seemingly random point here is this. If you're concerned about the IRA and what they're doing to influence American minds, you should be equally, if not more, concerned about domestic organizations on both sides of the aisle doing the same thing. Ostensibly, these organizations operate legally and can get away with similar things that Russia did via its troll factory. And I don't have a great solution for this problem, but by building out our understanding of their networks and associated infrastructure, and then publicizing that information so that consumers can better understand where their news is coming from, maybe that can serve in some fashion as an influencer vaccine. So, thank you very much.
Hi, in your research, have you encountered data collection from these domains and these sites? What sort of cookies were used, for example, and is there consistency between those sites in the same cookie being set and the same script being passed?
That's a great question. Admittedly, I haven't gone that far into researching those identified domains beyond their association with IRA and the associated individual. But I think there's definitely an opportunity there for additional research to build out our understanding of how those websites are working.
Thank you for this impressive presentation, some really fascinating research in there. I wondered whether you could make explicit for us some of your internal conversations about ethical considerations to make an individual, name an individual with a moderate confidence assessment.
I discussed this with my team at Threat Connect. We went over the research, made sure that they would come to the same analytic conclusion that I did, and ultimately, our understanding, or our sorry, I just want to make sure I think through this response. So part of our work goes towards showing the methodology to focus on how organizations can do the same thing against their own threats. Additionally, another part of that is we feel that by exposing infrastructure, exposing individuals that we believe, based off of that analysis, are associated with those activities, that we are increasing the actors' cost. And we are essentially creating a deterrent for them to do that sort of activity or be associated with that sort of activity in the future.
Hi, I'm wondering if you've seen a move since GDPR, if you've seen threat actors moving into GDPR jurisdictions to avoid precisely this kind of exposure?
Good question. hard to say. I wouldn't want to indicate one way or the other on that. I would say, however, that even with GDPR, there are ways that we can still do this sort of research. Notably, like I showed, doing that timestamp research, we can get at additional information. Taking a look at start of authority records, that can still get us at a email address, even when there's a GDPR enacted. So, yeah, hard to say.
Hey, so in response to some of your comments about stuff on the domestic side, where do you kind of end up drawing that line between information operations, political activity, and then just kind of activism? Like, I feel like once we start talking about domestically, like, yeah, there are some groups, I think pretty much everybody would agree, this is like a little beyond the pale, but I feel like once you kind of start emphasizing that domestic aspect, things can get a little iffy, since a lot of those same information operations really do turn into politics at a certain point. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, I mean, admittedly, I'm not a information operations expert. I couldn't delineate that very well. But I know in the case of this organization, and I feel like I know that there are rules associated with how PACs and super PACs work. I think that has to be incorporated into that sort of research and determining the extent to which, a Definers or America Rising PAC are actually doing something illegitimate or against the rules. I will point out that one of the organizations here that is associated with Definers, Power the Future, they have a Facebook page with over 70,000 followers, and they do not indicate any relationship with Definers or America Rising. So, to me, that seems shady, but I'm a cybersecurity individual. I don't know if that's against the rules.
So maybe just use this as an opportunity to extend on that. I thought that pivoting to the domestic space was really valuable, and I think it speaks to, in some ways, how resources are appropriated, and that some of the technical expertise in the room could be incredibly valuable for our domestic conversation. And so I really appreciate that you did this. I thought it was novel and it was just compelling. Could you talk a little bit more about what sort of incentives could be created in order to get people with your expertise to be doing more of this, to service more of this in a domestic context? How do we get more visibility into this type of work and more activity on a domestic front? Is it partnership with journalists? Is it kind of positive intention in other ways? Could you?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have a good answer for you. I would say having a partnership with journalists could be very beneficial, and helping to identify what different organizations might be worth looking into. But for me, I was starting to get really upset with a lot of the stuff that I saw going on in the news, and so that just motivated me to take some personal action outside of work and trying to, build out this sort of research in a realm that's not really related to cybersecurity. So, if there are other individuals that, are feeling that same way and have a similar motivation, then maybe that is a reason for them to do that research.
Just kind of a testament to what they said. I think there's definitely more to be done with partnering in some journalists on some of these findings and people who are working in the space. I think it's interesting. It can be valuable to find pivots in some of these nuggets to look into, but there is kind of a danger in saying, like, I worry about seeing these slides that say, like, we know that this is part of this information operations campaign based on this one piece of data, because of the fact that information operations campaigns, as we talked about earlier, really proliferate in different ways. And I think that it's just a worrisome danger to start going down that path of, like, the pivots and where this goes and where you find these other domains. And then how do you validate that as part of the other piece of the information operations piece? I think then requires, like, okay, you have this information cluster. Now you need to look at where does this actually proliferate as far as the websites, and where do they show up in other pieces of an information operations campaign? I'm glad you pointed out specifically that you saw some of this come back around with the IRA and the indictments, but I think there's interesting stuff we can talk about later, but about questions for other domains that necessarily didn't come up in the IRA indictment about then how do you assess confidence with those of whether they're part of the same information operation or not, right?
Sure, yeah, and very fair point. While you're doing this, you have to keep in mind, the avenue that you took to get to those additional domains, and keep in mind, what are the alternative explanations for why you might see the same whois across multiple domains, or see the same Google account or Google Analytics account number across several domains. So, and then appropriately caveat your findings based off of that. Yeah, so I agree.